Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. Pleasure to be with you. And I'll be glad to get back to your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Emails go to talk@larslarson.com. As you can imagine, I stand in a studio that is only operational because of electricity. We've got television screens, we've got computers, we've got microphones and things like that. So I want to make sure that the electricity stays turned on. The problem is, Frank Gaffney, the founder and president of the Center for Security Policy, and I have talked for literally years about the fact that America's electric grid is one of the most vulnerable pieces of our national infrastructure that's very much at risk, not only from terrorists and attacks of that nature, but from computer hacking that might be done by terrorists or might be done just by people trying to cause trouble, but also from natural forces like solar flares and the like. Frank, welcome back to the program.
It's great to be with you, Lars. Thank you.
So you point out that the president, actually back as a candidate in the summer of 2015, sat down with electric executives, federal bureaucrats, and some utility company representatives, and they talked about the fact that this is a critical part of our national infrastructure and that to some extent the electric companies were getting in the way of making the kinds of improvements we need to make the electrical grid safe. Can you characterize how big a problem this is?
Well, it's a huge problem, but let me just set the predicate here.
Sure.
It actually wasn't executives or federal bureaucrats who were in the room. It was my colleague, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, who was describing how those bureaucrats and electric utility executives have consistently, systematically, and unfortunately very effectively blocked every effort to protect the electric grid against the sorts of threats that you just mentioned, specifically the worst of them, electromagnetic pulses that could be induced by a nuclear weapon detonated in space or by the sun, as you say, a solar flare, intense solar storm. But what Peter told the president, he's now the president, of course, at the time he wasn't even a candidate, but he told him was these guys are simply intractably opposed to doing something like this. And the guy said at the time, when I'm president, I'm going to come to Washington and I'm going to knock their heads together to protect the grid. And the exciting thing is, Lars, as president, he's taken the first critical step towards doing that, which is back in the end of March, issuing an executive order that affirms what we've been saying on this program and in a lot of other places as well, is an existential threat to this country, namely this phenomenon of electromagnetic pulse. And he's directed the federal agencies, all those bureaucrats, and he's directed them to work with the private sector as well to fix the problems that currently make the grid a giant kick-me sign for every enemy we have, because they all understand that if they could take down our grid, they can take down our country. And they're preparing to do it. They have doctrinal direction to do it, and it's a matter of time until they do it if we don't take this sort of step. Now, the challenge is, and I was just down with Dr. Pry and some of the country's other leading experts in this field at a terrific program that was being run by a lieutenant general by the name of Stephen Klost at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, Lars. And they're talking about specifically how do you do this? How do you implement the president's direction? And the trouble is, quite truthfully, that there's a new study that was just released today by an outfit called the Electric Power Research Institute, or EPRI, that's telling everybody, hey, there's no problem. You don't need to worry about it. If there is a problem, we got it under control, but there isn't a problem.
Well, now, hold on, Frank. So what's the gist of why they say there's no problem? Because there's no debate that an EMP, whether it's generated by, a nuclear weapon exploded in the atmosphere or by a solar flare, that either one of those could interrupt the grid. Why are they saying there's no problem?
Yeah, there's all this experience. There's all this testing. There's all of this research over 60 years, much of it done on a classified basis by the Department of Defense. And basically what the scientists that this trade association-sponsored institute came up with is roughly the counterpart to the kind of junk science that was used in the 60s and 70s, memorably, Lars, captured in that film, remember this? Thank You for Smoking?
Oh, yeah, I do.
Yeah, well, it's really not a problem for your health that you smoke. In fact, it's good for your health. 2 packs a day will make you even healthier than if you don't do it at all. That's the kind of science that's now being pushed forward that says, never mind all of that data. Never mind the fact that the Defense Department has spent billions of dollars worrying about and fixing this problem. We want you to just pretend it's all well and good and trust us.
Now, Frank, let me jump to this. Why would and here's the part I don't understand structurally. If you go to the electrical companies and you say, listen, the grid is vulnerable. You don't have backup transformers. If transformers, some of the massive ones that literally take years to build, they have to be brought on special rail cars and all that, and they're not even manufactured, as I understand it, for the most part in this country. Right. You don't have backup. So if you had a big part of the grid, just part of the national grid knocked out, you'd say, well, bring in the replacement parts. They don't exist. They have to be built. And there isn't a warehouse full of stores or spares or several warehouses, regional centers around the country. We could do that right now, and we could even harden some of these so that if they were hit by a pulse, it wouldn't necessarily destroy them. It might mean that they're damaged, but you'd at least be able to limp along till you got things in place. That if that's the case, why would the utility company care? As I understand, if you tell them we have to do this to fix this and you can pass the cost along, and since much of the costs will be long-term costs, pieces of infrastructure that last for decades, you'll be able to pass the costs along to your ratepayers and they'll have to pay the bill. Why would the utility companies care if they're in the same way that if you say every automobile has to have a seatbelt and an airbag or other required safety equipment, you pass the costs along to your customers, and if they're spread out over hundreds of millions of customers over decades, the costs don't have to be extraordinary either, and all the utility company does is pass it through, don't they?
That's a distinct possibility, Lars. The costs are not that huge if you do it sensibly. Preferably, you don't keep compounding the problem by building more stuff that needs to be protected.
Right.
You build the protection in from the get-go. Those new transformers and SCADA systems, as they're called, that operate them and so on. This is something that we ought to be doing right now. But the basic answer to your question, as best I've been able to figure it out, it's not that utility executives aren't patriots or that they don't have families that will die if the grid goes down and stays down, or that they're indifferent to the fact that their customers will die, or that it's some insuperably high cost and they can't bear it. I think it fundamentally comes down to this. They've been focused throughout their professional lives on maintaining the reliability of the grid, and they really haven't given a thought to making it as well resilient. And when you ask them to do that, they're afraid that maybe you'll make it less reliable, and that will be a problem. And it's so much easier to just say, it's not a problem at all. Let's just pretend we're fine, and we won't have to take any risks. Cost and other considerations secondary to the idea that they just don't want to screw up what's working right now.
Yeah.
And I get that. But the point is, we can't afford to lose the grid. And that's what is in distinct prospect now, even if no enemy attacks us, knowing that they can destroy us if they do.
That's absolutely right. Frank, thank you for the time. That's Frank Gaffney, the founder and president of the Center for Security Policy in Washington, D.C.